I worked for an appliance company one time for a while, and in Columbus, Ohio, and they were established in 1939. It was a tight-knit work family. A lot of people there. The owner passed away. His son passed away unexpectedly, so he sold it to the employees. And there was a massive customer base that we had acquired. It was so massive that we raised our prices to weed out certain undesirable customers. And you think, what is an undesirable customer? And I can tell you unequivocally, that is an Ohio State student who can't find their checkbook when you show up to fix their appliance. That is an undesirable customer. But in all seriousness, sometimes we'd have irate customers because one of our managers would overpromise, underdeliver on a regular basis. And I was the one delegated to go visit them. This owner's his name was Scott, because they're not around anymore, so I can say this. Sometimes I'd get to work, I'd start stocking my van with the parts, and I'd go through the route of what was to be that day. And some mornings I'd show up and there'd be a Post-it with an address, and this is true, I'm not making this up, would say, Drew, make it right. So I knew that this was someone who was very angry about something. And it happened quite a bit because the source of irritation, since we had such a big customer base, it could be a new build in Cincinnati where their appliances were delivered and they were stainless steel, but one wasn't, or one didn't show up, or somebody damaged the doorway, or one of the most common ones, things weren't delivered when they said they would be delivered. So these people, for whatever reason, were irate, that had spent a lot of money. And, I was compensated very well for this. Because I would go to my boss, I worked on commission. I said, how am I going to make any money? He said, well, I'll take care of your whole day, whatever your highest day was last week. And sometimes it would only take me 3.5 or 4 hours to get this resolved. So, my coworkers would be like, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes. I'd be like, I know, somebody's got to do it. And knock off at noon. But no, it was hard. It was a difficult thing to deal with. And yeah, I'm going somewhere with this. But they took care of me financially. But I had a secret, and the secret was I liked it. I liked doing it. I liked going to the doorstep of an angry person and being able to leave knowing that they were happy and they were smiling. Because, I show up and the first thing you got to do is let people get it out of their system. Call me a crook. And the outfit, and what are we trying to do, and how can we do business like this? And when people get really mad is when they start referring to you as you people. You people, you're like, here we go. You're going to really start lacing into me now. So just let it happen. Let them wear themselves out, and then go into Andy Griffith mode and start rubbing their belly, metaphorically speaking, calming them down. And this, to me, was satisfying. I would withstand all these insults, and by the time I would leave, it would be a thank you followed by apologies for the way they talked to me. But most importantly, they were happy. They knew I cared. Aside from ministry, this was one of the most satisfying elements of any job I'd ever had because it made me feel like a Joseph, made me feel powerful. How I could go into a place where somebody's irate and change that all the way around. Which brings this whole topic up. How do we love the unlovable? How do we approach a person filled with contempt who's always nasty and try to love on them? What makes them that way? Why are they that way to begin with? Anger is typically a secondary emotion. It comes from selfishness. Selfishness is fostered by fear. The fear of many things, being alone, being unhappy, or just failing, not getting what you want. If you look at it just the way we look at toddlers, the way they behave. I want that because that makes me happy. And if I can't have that, I'm going to be sad. I'm afraid of being sad. I don't like it. So I want that because that makes me happy. And if I can't have it, I'm going to be angry. Well, that's really what anger is in all of life. Even on the freeway, somebody cuts you off. What are you really mad about? You're mad because you want to be where they are. They're there. I should be there. It is a secondary emotion, almost always grounded in selfishness. In my life experience, I've learned that the most powerful you can feel in this life, if you want to feel like you are wielding true power, unearthly power, it's not by having your boot heel in someone's shoulder blades controlling them. It's not by keeping someone down. It's by lifting them up and out of and rescuing them from their own anger, from their own selfishness. If you know a person that's mean to you and they're angry to you, I can promise you, you're not the problem. You may be the one they're uncorking on, but there's something else going on inside there. The most satisfying power you can have, wielding godly power, is to pull people out of that muck, that anger. It's so simple. We do this with animals all the time. People do this with animals, dogs. Many people at one time or another, they find a lost dog, and he's snarling and growling. And what do they say? They always say this thing, "Oh, look, he's scared. He's hungry, he's scared. What's wrong, buddy?" And he continues to snarl. And they know, oh man, there's something wrong with this poor little guy. And they recognize this truth. They want to help him. Sometimes they film it. You see the dog on the internet. Oh, look how mean he was. Then later he's all happy, and because they loved on him. They knew he was scared. They knew there was something going on that made him mean. Recognizing this truth about people should be just as simple because it exists. It's an extremely rewarding to uplift someone, to turn off their anger and see joy start to fill their heart and move across their face. And it is for this reason that God has given us powerful instruction regarding loving the unlovable. It's not only for their benefit. It's for our benefit too, because it does make life better. Our church motto. And I promise you, there is hardly a feeling so satisfying as turning a person who feels unloved into feeling someone who feels loved. That's power. Matthew 5:43 through 48, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do that? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." No one is unlovable. We think of it that way because we always associate love with that emotion thing. How you love your wife or how you love your children, or love is an action though. We're not talking about that wonderful emotion that comes to the people in your life that you're closest to. We're talking about love, the action, as an action. You don't need to have a deep fondness to constantly be around a person so strongly that it invokes this love. That's not the love we're talking about. But let's unpack this, starting at verse 43, where he says, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Okay, I bring this up a lot, and when I say things a lot, it's because I don't want you to forget it. When Jesus says, "You have heard it said," what he's saying is, he's not diminishing or downgrading the Old Testament. He raises it to a higher standard. When a rabbi says, "You have heard it said," what he means is another rabbi told you this. He's not saying the Bible said this. In fact, we'll get to that in a minute. It's quite the opposite. When a rabbi says, "You've heard it said," he means these other rabbis told you this. So keep that in mind, because you have heard it said. In other words, other rabbis have told you, Pharisees, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies." So in other words, only love the lovable. And feel free to hate unlovables. But our righteousness is to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees in the way that we choose to love. So Jesus is quoting in part, stick with me here, this is important. Jesus in part is quoting Leviticus 19:18. Remember, this is the Old Testament. Leviticus 19:18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." So you notice that in verse 43 that there are a couple of differences between what Jesus says and what Leviticus says. Two things. First, there is no reference to hating anyone in Leviticus. Jesus mentions this because he knows that hate was falsely taught by the Jewish leaders, by the Pharisees. And notice that God told the people that they were to love their neighbors as they loved themselves. So Jesus is hammering home this principle. Even the Old Testament says love your neighbors as love yourselves, not hate people. You were taught that. God didn't say that. You have heard it said. You were taught that. But I tell you, that's why it says, but I tell you, because he is the authority. So what Jesus has done in this instance is he has combined the scripture with the commonly taught practice of the day. So in the context of Leviticus 19 and other Old Testament passages, the Jews understood their neighbors as just being fellow Jews. Well, that's who it is. Jesus corrects that thinking. They were under the false impression that they did not have to love those who were not Jews. And they were wrong. The part about hating an enemy came from an inference, and I have to acknowledge this, that the Jews made from the Old Testament. Something they just kind of put in there. The thought, the school of thought, in other words. When the Israelites were taking possession of the promised land, God told them not to make treaties with any inhabitants of the promised land. You do not make treaties with the enemies of God. That was the message. And some people say, some theologians said they told them to kill a lot of them in some cases. But we'll start off on the light end and just go with that, with what it says. Do not be friends with these people. They're enemies of God. That's what God tells. I'll read it. It's in Exodus 34:11 through 16. Old Testament. And remember why we're saying this. This is what gave the Jews the idea that it was okay to hate your enemies. Here it is. Observe what I command you in this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. These are all Gentiles who would not worship the God of Abraham. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other God. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And we've talked about human jealousy versus what the context of God. That's another message. If you have questions, I'll gladly answer them. Not the same thing. It's not envy. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifice to their gods, and one of them invites you to eat the sacrifice, and you take of his daughters for your son, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. The easy way to say that is, don't get involved in heathen religions, and then your sons are going to have children with them, and then you're all going to be heathens, and all your kids are going to be heathens, and it's never going to stop. You're all going to have your backs turned on me. That's the easy way to say it. So the Jews drew this inference that God hated these people, and therefore they were to hate them as enemies too. The Jews considered all the Gentiles to be their enemies, but the truth of the matter was that God did not hate these people. They, along with their false religions, would drag the Israelites away from God, and that's what he could not have. That's what God doesn't hate his own creation, his children that were created in the image of him. I'm going to expand on that a little bit more. I'm going to go down just a really quick rabbit hole. Throughout history, God has removed the influence of evil from the presence of his people. Man turned his back on God, and that's why we die. That's why we eventually die. Death is the penalty of sin. Sodom and Gomorrah, it grew larger and larger with the influences of all sins. People like to talk about the homosexuality. There's all kinds of sins going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. The influence of evil was there. Wiped them out. The known world, becoming too full of evil influence, was wiped out in a flood by God. You can look at it the incorrect way, which is what they were doing, and say, God wiped out these civilizations because he hates these people. Or you can look at it the correct way, which is God wiped out civilizations that had become so saturated with evil by the devil's influence that he could not tolerate it to spread any further. That's the accurate way. It is not the accurate way to say, I wiped them out because I hate them. It's not what he did. He said, I gotta stop. Listen, if I raise livestock and I have a cow that has anthrax, that animal has something that has changed it. It is not what it used to be. It is not what it was designed to be. It was not what it was created to be. There is something wrong with it, something horribly wrong with it. It suffers from something so destructive that its very presence among its own kind can affect them and destroy them as well along with it. I have to remove it. I have to remove it. I can't tolerate it staying there. I don't hate it, but I can't let it go on. I can't let it go on. You see the point there that I'm trying to make? God doesn't wipe these civilizations because he has a personal hate like we do. So we should never think, we should always, step one to loving the unlovable was forget the whole idea of hate. It shouldn't be in your heart. It shouldn't be a part of the way you think as a Christian. And we're people, we're flawed. I know it creeps in. We got to fight it out. In the Jewish writing, there are all kinds of disparaging things said about the Gentiles. The Jews felt that they could hate these people. They didn't have to even save them from dying. They had utter contempt for Gentiles. This is one of the reasons that the story of the Good Samaritan had such a stinging message for religious leaders. And if you weren't here for that message, it's still on our YouTube channel. That message is one of the most mistaught and misunderstood messages in the Bible. But it speaks to this point. And if you think you know it, you should listen to that message or research it. God never, ever intended for his people to be a people of hate, ever. He never intended that. And in fact, on a side note, if you look at the practices of warfare now that Israel employs in the way they do combat, they are a merciful army. They are an extremely merciful. They're deadly, swift, and they'll never go down because they're the Lord's army. But they're compassionate in the way they wage warfare. God never intended for his people to be a people of hate. We were to be an example to the rest of the world of how how we all will conduct ourselves, much like the church is today. Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. That's what we want the world to see. So Jesus is going to tell us that there is a better way for those who belong to his kingdom, because sometimes hate's a cop-out. It's the easy way out. The natural way for us to deal with people is to basically treat them the way that they treat us. I mean, that's what everybody says. Treat others the way they treat you. Well, yeah, that's not always the best policy. And Jesus will tell us that his people will act in a different manner. We're not going to be part of that kind of foolishness. We're above that. We're above that. Which, in a way, to be above something doesn't mean we look at ourselves as above other people. We are above an evil standard is what we are above. If anything, we lift people. We're above an evil standard. We're not better than other people. Matthew 5:44 through 45 says, I say to you, here we go again, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and unjust. So Jesus brings a whole new way to see the truth, the right way. Love your enemies. God's love embraces the entire world. That's why John 3:16 is in there. For God so loved the world. Not for God so loved the Jews a lot, the Gentiles, and then a few others. Doesn't say that. It says for God so loved the world. And we're not talking about the planet. We're talking about the inhabitants. In this case, in this context of the word world, we're talking about the inhabitants he created of mankind. And he loved each of us, even while we were still sinners. And this we're going to get this a little deeper on this. We were his enemies. Romans 5:8 through 10. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? So you see what's being said here. Those who refuse to trust in God are his enemies. This is the most important thing. Listen to me. Those who refuse to trust in God are his enemies. But here's the thing. He's not their enemy. He's not their enemies. They are his enemies, but he's not their enemies. In the same way, we are not to be the enemies of those who may be enemies to us. These are matters of the heart we're discussing. Remember this. I'm going to address the exceptions because they're always floating around in people's heads and I can't let them just slip by. I'm going to. From their perspective, the people that I opened with, why are these people so nasty? You just can't get to them. From their perspective, we are their enemies. But from our perspective, they should be our neighbors. That's a hard pill to swallow. But that's what Jesus commands. That's what we have to rise above. That's what we have to rise to the level of to be like him. Jesus' command for unrestricted love is grounded in one's relationship to the Father, which necessarily demands a love surpassing conventional standards or expectations. So the natural response is for us, and this is another thing I say a lot, it's natural for us to want to repay evil with evil, to get back at somebody. But to bless and pray for those who persecute you is to align yourself with the character of God. So I'm going to say that again. To bless and pray for those who persecute you is to align yourself with the character of God. I read a story one time about General Lee, the Confederate Army. Somebody asked him about a soldier under his command, another soldier, and said, "What do you think about him?" And General Lee said, "I think he's very satisfactory and he does fine work." Now, this soldier had been talking smack about General Lee. He hated him. He talked bad about him all the time. And they asked General Lee what he thought of him. And he said, "He's a good soldier, does a good job, satisfactory." And the reporter's perplexed and said, do you know what he's been saying about you?" And General Lee said, "You didn't ask me what he's been saying about me. You asked me what I thought of him." That's a classy answer. That's always the high road. Always the high road. That's the way to deal with that. And this isn't about the North and South. It's about a man who said the right thing, who looked at it through the right perspective. I'm not going to get you back just because you threw mud at me. I'm going to nah. That's the thing about slinging mud. Don't do it. Get your hands dirty and you lose ground. Pray for your enemies. Pray for your persecutors. You ever had a person you had trouble with? Maybe you really dislike them in a big way because of something they had done to you. We've all had that. Or sometimes just have a person that gives us a hard time constantly. These are the people Jesus is talking about. These are the people he tells us to pray for. And one of the reasons is that sometimes prayer is all you can do. We're not supposed to go around busting each other in the mouth. Mostly. I was reminded that Mike Tyson had a great quote. He said years ago, many of you remember it, he said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." There's a lot of Christian application in that. If you look at what it means beyond the simplicity of the words, we're going to get detoured a lot. And it's going to get tough. I mean, that's really what the message, despite the comic surface value, there's a lot of truth in it. These are the type of people that Jesus tells us to pray for, the people that constantly coming after us, constantly making life hard. We have to change them and their attitude toward us. And sometimes prayer is where we have to start always. Certainly if they remain hostile to us when we approach them. It's hard to hate someone you're praying for all the time too. It is. If you are praying for someone's heart to heal and to be better and to be more loving and forgiving, when you see them, you start seeing them like that dog. That growling dog with the food on his rib cage. You start to feel sorry for him. It's like when I show up at those people's door. "You people!" I know I'm not a bad guy. I didn't do anything to these people. But I'm the one that's going to feed them. I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to make them okay. And I knew that going into it. So you people me all day long. I can take it. That's power. That's the power God wants us to have. Stephen even prayed when they were killing him. In Acts 7:60, falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. He died. Jesus did the same thing in Luke 23:34. He asked forgiveness for the people who were murdering him. Boy, they just don't know what they do. Please forgive them, for they know not what they do. They have no idea how evil this is. In verse 46 of what I was reading earlier from Matthew, Jesus tells the crowd that loving the unlovable is something that even the tax collectors do. And that is, in that community, was the lowest scumbag you could be. A friend of mine who came to Christ a few years ago in a much deeper, meaningful way is a tax collector. And he called me, hey, he wanted to know if I thought he was going to go to hell for being a tax collector. So I had to explain to him, and I'm going to explain to you, for maybe 2 or 3 of you who don't know this, tax collectors in that time and that place were typically not just a tax collector, usually one of your own that the Romans made do it. And they would skim and keep money. It would be like all of us living in the same neighborhood, and suddenly the Romans take over and they come and make me a tax collector. So I was your friend and your pastor, and the next day I'm at your door going, I'm going to need $500. What are you doing, Drew? Taxes. You got to pay your taxes. What do you mean? I thought we were friends. Pay up or I'm throwing you in jail. What? That's betrayal. That's dirty. You would be really upset with me if I did that. And that's what the tax collectors were. They were the people who used to be your friends, used to be your buddies. Not all of them, but a great many of them. And that's like, can you believe that? That's betrayal. That is dirty. And that's why tax collectors are talked about the way they are so much. It's not just that they're collecting taxes. It says a lot about the character, the way things were run. Complete disregard for loyalty to God, to friendships. That's just a side note. But I'll tell you, when Jesus said, don't even the tax collectors love people you can love that are lovable. Even they do that. They're friends. Those were some of the most devastating and insulting words these religious leaders had ever heard. They were probably enraged because tax collectors were traitorous, extortioners, almost by definition, dishonest, heartless, and irreligious. So in the eyes of most Jews, Gentiles were outside the pale of God's concern as well. Fit only for destruction as his enemies and the enemies of those who thought they were his people. Remember, in the Old Testament, they basically said, they looked at it and said, he told us to have nothing to do with these people. So then they started teaching hate. God, that's like, the world does that now. Where the Bible says, hey, don't be homosexual. And then people say, oh, look, God wants us to hate them. And put up signs that says God hates fags and insult them and burn their God never said that. He never said that. He's got a whole list of sins not to do. Everybody does one of them. So each person has to look at their own sin and go, this is the one I need to work on. Not throw rocks at other people. And then justify the hate. Well, God hates it. God says he hates. There are some things God said he hates, but they were sins, not people. And the Jews thought it was okay to hate. You don't have to love them if they're unlovable. In the eyes of Jesus, he teaches us that the citizens of God's kingdoms are to have the absolute highest standard of love and every other aspect of righteousness that goes with it than the whole rest of the world. So if you ever have a mandate as a Christian, that's the first one you need to think about. Now, we'll get down this rabbit hole that I wanted to bring up. This doesn't mean you are to be a sucker. All right? God doesn't expect you to be a sucker, a fool, or a doormat. You know, Jesus said, turn the other cheek and let him strike the other cheek. There was a lot in the depth of that message and the context of what was going on. But the way you live your life, if someone walks up to your door and says, can I have all your food? My family doesn't have anything to eat, and you give them all your food and your family starves, you're a sucker. That's not loving people. That's not the way. And I don't want the message to be, go out and let people walk all over you. God doesn't want that for his people either. I'm not suggesting that anyone be a doormat. There are times to fight. You have to defend your home, your family, and your livelihood. For every man, that's a mandate. That's got to come first. Luke 22:36. Jesus said, if you have a purse, take it. Also a bag. If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Jesus said that. Now, there are times when we have to fight back. We have to fight the good fight while continuing to pray for our enemies. We still continue to pray. We still love the unlovable, and we still absolutely forbid feelings and thoughts of hate. Some people argue that this verse in the Bible, I've heard this a lot. They say, well, this verse is misunderstood. It's a metaphor. What Jesus actually meant when he said buy a sword is prepare yourself. Hard times are coming. That's what that was. Poppycock, that's not true. And the reason that's not true is, first of all, if it were true, Jesus never included unnecessary information and analogies. He wouldn't have had to include anything that said sell this and buy a sword. But more importantly, we know it was meant literally because they had swords with them. They had swords with them. In Luke 22, 49 through 51, when they came to arrest Jesus, and this is expanded in Matthew 26 in much more detail, but it says, when Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? Wait, let me read that again. Should we strike with our swords? Should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant, and the high priest, cutting his ear off. A lot of people tell that story and go, oh, Peter grabbed a sword from a Roman soldier. That's not what it says. It says, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Jesus answered, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed it. What's the takeaway? Well, the takeaway is stay equipped to fight the good fight, but use love as the chief weapon. Love is always the chief weapon. Sometimes you have to fight and stand your ground. This whole thing can be a metaphor for when you watch. We see so much war now. When you see pictures coming from war zones of our boys, our American soldiers, our Marines, our guys out there getting it done, the pictures that move you in your heart are not the ones where they're holding AR-15s, grenade belts, ammo straps, and bayonets and firing at the enemies. These aren't the ones that move you to tears. The ones that move you to tears are the pictures of the soldiers that are holding AR-15s, grenade belts, ammo straps, and bayonets, and holding a small child while giving him his stuffed animal, or holding a bottle in his mouth, or walking him back to his family in a combat zone. Those are the pictures that touch your heart. These powerful men that could certainly, you know, Marines don't like being called kids. They don't like we put our kids in harm's way. A Marine will tell you, I am harm's way. But when they hold these babies and these little kids and they scoop them up, that's when we cry, isn't it? Isn't that what we see? We go, man. I mean, I'm just thinking about it. I see that and I'm like, look, all that power. But the most effective weapon, the one that has reached inside of me and just wrung my heart out, is the love. The love weapon right there on display. Those are the pictures. That's the power of God's chief weapon over anything we can make. And you can tell by looking at these guys, they're not suckers. Nobody's going to walk on them. That's the way we go in. The full armor of God, to use that analogy, is too easy. It's a different topic. We're talking about loving the unlovable. You can fight the good fight and still love those against you, loving the unlovable. They choose to be our enemies doesn't mean we have to choose to be theirs. They can choose to be our enemies. They're choosing the world way, which is a world system that stands in direct opposition to Christ. We can let them be our enemies. We can take care of ourselves. We can defend our ground. But we can exercise everything in the way Christ taught it. Loving and praying for an enemy is not what the world would do, but it's what a Christian is supposed to do. And we are to be different in thought and action from the world. So I'm trying to wind this out. This was a long one. Sorry, guys. Go up. Just going to get through this really quick. Loving and praying for an enemy is not what the world would do, but it's what we're expected to do. And these are the ways to show love to the unlovable. A lot of them are common sense, but they're good to think about. Number one is pray for them. Prayer is a powerful tool for softening our hearts and aligning our will with God's. When we pray for those who hurt or oppose us, we begin to see them through God's eyes as individuals in need of grace and redemption, like that growling dog. Prayer also shifts our focus from our grievances to God's purposes. That's massive. Shifts our focus from our grievances to God's purposes. Number 2, respond with kindness. In Romans 12:20, Paul writes, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. And Sun Tzu's The Art of War says, take care of your prisoners. Because when they go back to their enemies, they're going to be like, hey, they took good care of me. Really? More of them will surrender. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that what we do? When people come in here and they see what Christian and Christ is really like, more of them will surrender to Christ. Wow. It's amazing how that works. Kindness has the power to disarm hostility and open the door to reconciliation. Even small acts of compassion can have a profound impact. Number 3, forgive as Christ forgave. Forgiveness is central to loving the unlovable. Jesus modeled this on the cross when he prayed, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Forgiveness, listen to this. Forgiveness releases us from bitterness and reflects the grace we have received. What's that mean? We are paying it forward as his instruction. Number 4, rely on the Holy Spirit. Loving the unlovable is not something we can achieve in our own strength. We need the guidance and empowerment of the Holy Spirit to overcome our natural tendencies to extend Christ-like love. Through prayer, submission, the Spirit will enable us to do what seems impossible. It's not impossible. You don't know how bad this person was to me, Pastor. It's not. What's the Bible say? With God, all things are possible. And you heard me say this a couple weeks ago. Sorry to bring it up again. Sorry, not sorry. That old saying, to repay good with evil is evil. To repay good with good is human. But to repay evil with good is divine, which is what Christ did to us. He repaid our evil with his sacrifice. So to love the unlovable. Last paragraph. Love is an action. Your conduct towards them is how you reflect Christ. When you must fight, fight the good fight and continue praying for them. Just because they may be your enemy doesn't mean you have to be theirs. Seek resolution and restoration, never revenge. This is the way of God. And for those who know him, for those who know God, none of them ever leaves the world on their deathbed wishing they would have been more cruel to their enemies. They only leave wishing they would have been kinder. All right.